Hello, Ken Spriggs here with part 2 of my 2001 Clavius dome base build that's 3D printed. A lot of progress done on this. Jerry worked on the landing pad, the octagonal pad, redesigned it so that the orientation was correct. As I left off in my last video, the inner square part was shifted in the wrong direction. So he actually made one piece for the base, which I worked on and I'll show here shortly. And it's actually a much better design in just one piece. So it's gonna correct those issues that I had before on the first one. I also want to thank the various people on the subscribers who have left comments and made some suggestions, and certainly the different resources that people have given to me from Facebook that have helped to get a more accurate version of this kit. One of the comments from a subscriber by the name of B. Lee had given me some more information on why it appears that when the Aries lands on the base with the lights, that base seems much bigger than the Aries, and then it drops down and the base seems smaller, because which he pointed out, and it seems obvious now that he mentioned it, but the part with the lights on it does not go down with the elevator. That stays stationary, because obviously we don't see the lights in the part of the landing pad that goes down underneath. So only a square in the middle of that actually drops down. And I've tried to make my own styrene strip version of the various panels and that kind of thing on the landing pad. Now, I do want to clarify a couple of things. People have made different suggestions about looking for some other option for the Aries to be in scale, or make the actual base bigger, which would make it very, very large. So there were two things that I looked at when I decided to do this build at all. One was obviously the doing a coal version of the dome base, which is very iconic in the film. The second was that I had the really, really awesome Stargazer Aries, which is 1/144 scale. I've had that for a few years, and I've wanted to build it, but I haven't really had. I started it a few times, but really couldn't come up with an idea of how I would put that there, how I would display it and make it work. So when this came out, this was the perfect way that I could put those two things together. So in the end, the Aries is going to be a little out of scale with the actual base, because I'm limited in how big I can make this base for my display, and I'll talk about that in this video. So I had to make a few sacrifices as far as having the ship being just a little bit bigger than it actually would be. But it's not going to be down on the landing pad. It's going to be extended up in the air, so you're going to get a forced perspective. In addition, you also never see the Aries with the model of the actual dome. You never see them together. What you see is the dome, and it starts opening up. Then they do a reverse perspective where you see the spikes of the dome, but in the distance you see the smaller Aries, which is obviously some image. It's not really the model far away. But you never actually see the dome opened, the Aries in perspective with it and landed on it. So I have a little bit of leeway in that area, that I'm not comparing, no one's going to compare what I build to an actual image to say, look, I have a picture of the Aries inside the dome and it doesn't look in the right scale. It's not going to actually be that way. So in the end, I think it's going to look great, and I certainly think it's going to be a fantastic diorama. So, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at the progress that I made. All right, so I received the new design for the octagonal section from Jerry, and it is one piece, but like I've done before, I cut it in half. Well, the first thing I tried to do was I tried to position it angled up like this and supported it. And I put a lot of supports on it, but for whatever reason, none of it attached to the supports. And I noticed it partway through the print and just ended it and stopped. So I decided that I was gonna just cut it in half. So I cut it down the middle here in a way that it went from point to point and it went between two of the holes. So then I could just glue these together. Now, I'm going to be using this same ridged material that I used on the first one that I did. So it occurred to me that the only thing that needed to be changed for me, and it was, is the orientation of the holes. Because I don't care about these lines, I'm going to be doing my own. And the way I had to do it before was I had to do the separate pieces and get them to line up. So with this being all one piece, I don't have to do any of that. All I have to do is flip it over, glue these two together, and then put one whole piece over top of this, you know, mark it off, cut it out, and then just sand it flush around the edges so it matches up exactly. And then from this side, I can just use my pin vise and I can see all the holes, drill them through, and then I have the hole placements. Because I was going to add my own extra stripping and things like that to it anyway. He also, by the way, removed that outer big heavy lip, which I think is much better. So it shouldn't, it didn't look real, it didn't look like it should really be there, because if something was coming up that ramp and it hit a big, there would be no point of it, of having a ramp going down inside. Because you assume there's some machinery or something coming up to maintenance the Aries or whatever ship landed on here. So I can add all of that with styrene stripping. I don't have to do anything with it. And then plus, since I'll have the holes drilled through the styrene here, I can simply just line up the stripping around the edge of it. And he also put one on the inside, which I'm going to do as well, because that's really accurate. As I explained earlier in my video, and somebody pointed out, the part that the ship is actually on is much smaller than the lights. So I don't know if this is completely accurate. It looks pretty good, but the ship itself is more here in the center, because it would make sense that none of these lights would actually be a part of a platform that lowers down underneath. Not to mention the fact that when it lowers down, we don't see any lights around it. So that points it out as well. So that kind of explains why there is a discrepancy apparently from the bigger platform landing pad that the ship lands on, and when it goes underneath and we see it on a apparently smaller pad, because there is a smaller pad. So this actually looks pretty good. And if I use my, if I get my Aries, sorry, and I put that on here, so it's not terrible. I mean, it wouldn't fit down through there, of course, because of the upper part. But it's not that far off as far as the scale. And when it's up off the ground, it's going to look pretty accurate. And this certainly looks bigger than the ship would need to land on. So when it's higher up, I think it'll be fine. And the force perspective will help that to adjust it. So, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and get these glued together, like I said, upside down. And then I'm going to put the ribbed styrene onto it, and then we'll get this piece ready to go. All right, so I've also started printing the newer versions of these that he also did some corrections on. This is the first one that I did, and I had adapted it, as I told you, by slicing it off myself, and it's a little thin along here. So he beefed that up and he changed it up. He also added a little lip on this part, as you can see right here, in order to accommodate this plate, so it matches up and is flush with it. And also, I didn't realize it, but some of the detail didn't work. So this smooth part down in here was supposed to have some detail that I guess the file wasn't correct, so he fixed it. You can see on this one that there is detail down in here and also down in here. Okay, now these ones here line up good. This one's a little shorter because he beefed up the bottom, as I said, but it's not a big deal, because the only thing you're going to see in this is this outer part in here. That's it. You're not going to see the back, you're not going to see the sides, you're not going to see underneath. So I can easily just sand this, and I have to sand some of these pieces to make them smoother. but I can easily just bring it up and glue it into place where it's supposed to be, match it up. You can already see the cool idea here is that it's going to be round, but you're going to have these octagonal sections that kind of mirror each other in the middle. And then of course then you're going to have this piece, well, once it's done, you're going to have this going like this and being in the center of it. There you go. And the proper angle. So it kind of throws you off because you want these lines to match up evenly, but they don't. They actually match up with two of them, and then this will match up with two of them, and this side with two of them, and so on. So I think that's what threw him off, threw me off, and that's why initially he had the wrong orientation on this. So now that's going to be fixed, so it's going to work. So, all right. So I've been in communication with him about printing these. I was a bit concerned about this lip, so I put some supports on it. I think this is the first one I did. I think I put the supports too close to this part, which is supposed to be flush, and so I had this failure to here and back. I don't know why this failed, but not a big deal. Like, again, this is perfectly usable part because none of this is going to be visible. It doesn't really matter. The last one that I did, and I have one more printing right now, a little bit of a failure right here, and just a little bit right here. But other than that, came out successfully. And again, like, none of those are an issue. None of those affect my ability to use these parts in building the octagonal parts. So, all right. And again, I just printed these flat right down onto the build plate. The one that I'm printing right now, I didn't put any supports at all. I just put it flat down on the plate. I did put it in the Prusa slicer, and we'll see how it works out, but I have noticed sometimes if something is not completely flat on the bottom, that's when you can have some failures, like sort of like this right here. Like something wasn't quite right here. And this one up here too. So I sliced off a 0.5 millimeter, which is very, very thin, and then so it'll just be a slight bit lower than this, but if it works out good, I'll just do the same thing I'm doing with this and raise it up and put them together. And that'll give me 4 of them, and then I'll have 4 more to do. So, all right, so hopefully that one tests out good, and then we'll see how that works. All right, so I went ahead and put down some of the ridge styrene into the inside flat part of each of these here. And when I went to the hobby store, they didn't have the same one, so I ended up using something slightly different. Here it is right here in case you're interested. It's just the ridges are just a little more noticeable. They're a little bigger. You can kind of see there, which isn't bad. Now I made these all go sideways for each of them. And then of course the top, it just goes in one direction. You're probably going to see that. But it's not going to match up with any particular side, of course, because they're all going to be angled around it. Then I went back and I sanded smooth the sides as much as I could. It doesn't look smooth, but it is. Some little indentations. I had to cut down the inner edge of the bottom there because it wasn't lining up right, but once I did, then these all go together nicely. Now, some of them are a little higher than the others. The first couple that I did were before we adjusted it and adapted it, so it's a little bit higher. It doesn't matter. When I glue them, I'm just going to raise it up and glue it flush so the top is flush. I don't care what it looks like on the bottom, it doesn't matter. It's all going to be sunk down into the wood and you're not going to see it. But you are going to see all of this on the top, so that has to be correct. And it has to be basically smooth, rounded around the outer edge, not a big deal. But because you're really not going to see this either, that's going to be painted black, but you are going to have a gap in here between the back surrounding ring that goes around it. So, all right, so what I want to do right now is use some different styrene stripping, and I'm going to just put a little bit of slight detail onto these ridged parts before I start gluing these together. I'm not sure if I'm going to do anything else on the back walls just yet before gluing it together. We'll see once I start doing that if I'm going to put anything else up on top here, and it doesn't stop me from doing it once they're together either. So, all right. All right, so as you saw from the stills previously, I went ahead and put more detail onto the landing platform. I drew all the holes out around it. I'm debating, there are actually more lights, of course, on the landing bay. They're a lot closer together, but I don't know if I want to try to do that, mainly because there were holes already in this that I used as a guide to get them nice and straight. I'm just afraid that if I try to drill ones in between, which I'd have to do, you know, double them in between, that some of them might not look even enough, and these look really good for now. So I think I'll leave it alone, and then I think once I get the fiber optics in and they're glowing, it will fill that in for you and look better. But I went ahead and I used some styrene stripping, 2 different thicknesses of some square styrene stripping, and I first put an outline around the outside of the lights, which you can see in the images. Then there's one on the inside, and then there's an even smaller one on the inside. Then it has these other smaller strips with a octagonal look, and this octagon is offset from the other one, so the flat part is a point and so on. And so I'm not quite certain from the images, because again, we never see the ship landing on the pad that we see on the outside, and it's really hard to tell when it lands on the pad they made for it, for the big model. So I don't know if this part on the inside is the part that lowers down, or this inner part is the part that lowers down. But either way, it looks good, and it gives it more detail. It gives it more of a realistic scale to it. That, in the addition of the ridges that you can make out even more where the glue spots are. You're not going to see those glue spots, by the way. They're going to be hidden once I prime it and paint it and everything. So, okay. So this is done for now. I actually put a couple more little bits out here that I saw in the images. And I think once I get it painted and then I do a little bit of a wash or some weathering on it, it's going to bring out a lot of these grooves and certainly make it look more realistic in scale. All right, so this part's all done. It does have a bit of an overhang on the styrene. So what I'll end up doing is, once I get it fitted into the outer part of the interior, then I can trim that down if I need to. So, okay. All right, so I got the entire ring of the interior glued together, other than the platform in the center. And what I did was, I just, as you saw from the stills, I started by gluing sets of 2 together, clamping them. Because again, the only thing I was concerned about is that this is level, this part is level. I don't care about anything underneath. So if I turn it over, you're gonna see, obviously, not everything is straight, but I don't care. Once this is sunk down into the board that I'm going to use for the lunar surface, none of that's going to be visible. You're only really going to see this top part. This is all going to be black, and it's going to be just a little narrow groove around it, and then you're going to have the parts of the dome coming on, of course. Also in here, none of this matters. You're not going to see any of this inside of here. This will all be covered. And so the only thing I cared about was the top, this rounded part, the interiors, of course. And I did go back and I used some thin styrene strip, and I just added a little bit of lines, some details coming up on each of those to kind of give it a bit of an idea of scale yet again. And I can always add more too when I'm done, or before I'm done, and add it on. But I certainly think it adds to it. You know, the smaller the detail, the thinner the little bits, the more it gives it a greater scale and a look for it. And as I showed before, I finished the landing platform. So here's the landing platform. So this will just go into there. Slight bit of an overhang, but like I said, I can clean that up once I'm ready to get that down into place. But that's kind of how it's going to look. And in the film, the way we see it is sort of like, actually, let me turn it. Since we're looking at it from the one side, we're kind of seeing it like this. So we see the landing pad looking at us with a square. We see that octagon here like this with these lines. All right, so looking pretty sweet. Looks really, really cool. It's coming together nicely. It's pretty big, as you can see from my hand, so it's hard to get it all in frame unless I get way above it. All right. So I'm not ready to quite glue this down just yet because I want to go ahead and do the fiber optics in the light holes first and get those underneath. It'll be a lot easier to do that when this piece is separate. And then I think what I'm going to try to do is start working on the board that it sinks down into. I'm not sure if I'm quite ready to put any kind of primer on this yet, only because I want to just decide if I want any more detailing on any of this before I do. I want to go back in and just make sure I sand these a bit smoother. You really can't tell that there's a groove there, but I just want to make sure that's the only part that's a seam. And of course, you know, I'll have to get this cleaned up before I get that going as well. And then other than that, there's really not anything else that I have to worry about cleaning up on the parts that you're going to see. And then I can start looking at how it's going to be placed. I started printing the rest of the outer rings. I have one more set printing right now. And I figured out, I was doing that part that was kind of a spacer is all it was. Because on the original one, you would have this sitting on top of the spacer, which was a little bit wider, just a little gap. And so that part would, the spacer would be flush against the ring, and this would be out a little bit. But I don't need to really do that, and that's just wasting a lot of resin and printing time, because since this whole thing is going to be sunk down into the base, the wood, I can put it down to the right level so that this simply is the right height, because the top of this should be even with the top of this. And I don't need anything. I mean, I can use, I can just measure out how far they need to be. Certainly when I put this on the wood, I can draw the circle for it and figure out how it's going to go in there, and then I can draw in where these are going to be so I have them properly spaced, because I do have, you know, already a couple of those spacers printed, and that way that just gives me an idea, and I don't have to worry about putting anything lower. So once I get this down on the wood, this is going to be as thick as the whole thing's going to be down on the wood. So when I put the clay down for the lunar base, I don't have to waste a lot of it in order to bring it up, because it's about halfway up this, and there's nothing in front of it. There's just a gap in between that's going to be painted black, so you're not going to see that. And then the wedges coming up for the dome kind of thing. It'll all come together, and you'll start to see that more once I get the get it onto the wood and start getting those parts on there and show you how it's all going to work. So, all right, but definitely coming together, looking pretty fantastic. Really happy with that interior. Really happy with how much more accurate that looks when I went back and worked with Jerry, and he got it designed the way it's supposed to be. Okay. All right, so I'm working on the piece of wood that I'm going to use for the actual base that these parts are going to be attached to and sunk down into. So the first thing I determined was how wide and how long it's going to be. And that, again, is going to be controlled by my space to display it. So let me show you here. So up there's my 2001 area. So the best thing I thought of doing is, I have that middle area underneath the Discovery. I can move the Aries shelf and the whole thing over to be butt up against that cabinet there to the right. Once I do that, that leaves me about 22 inches, nearly 2 feet, on the left side. So I can take down the shelf for the astronaut. The astronaut can go over here or be put somewhere else. And then I'll be able to fit something that's 22 inches wide and at least as deep as that, which actually this board here, this is a board I already had as a shelf. This is about 16 inches, it is 16 inches deep. So what's going to end up happening is, as you can see, when I center this, I'm going to have room on the sides to add some of the extra panels and extra detail on the lunar surface, but none at the top or the bottom, which is fine. It doesn't have to be. The focus is not the outer parts. That's just to kind of blend it into the lunar surface. The main thing is the dome and the ship that you're going to see. So this will work fine. This is a lot more reasonable for me to work within. So I'm not doing 2 foot by 2 foot. I'm doing slightly under 2 feet by 16 inches, or 22 inches by 16 inches. So I drew a center line. I lined up this center part, and then what I'm doing is I'm using these as spacers. That's all they really are. So if you were to build it as he intended, now of course you're still going to have to sink it down. You put that in there and it creates a space, and then that area down in there is where the dome would go. And there's a notch, so if I had the full piece of the dome, it would glue down inside of there. But I don't need that piece. All it's doing is adding an extra thickness onto this surface, more clay for me to fill in. So it's just as easy for me to just measure it off as to where it's supposed to be. You can see the circle I drew. I moved it a little bit, so I had to move the part. And I also drew around where this is going to go. So this will be centered, and this will be cut down. This will drop down inside, and it'll go down low enough so that this will be level with the top of that. But I will have it out here. So in the end, these pieces are going to be glued right here, going around as the outer ring. This will be sunk down inside, and then there'll be a space in between, which will only be the thickness of this. So I'm simply going to paint that black anyway, and that's going to be covered with the dome halves, except for the little bit of spot in between them. So I'm not going to worry about that part. I mean, if need be, if it's really super visible, maybe I'll put some kind of machinery or something in it. We'll see. We'll see what I want to do. But all of this is going to be buried as well down to about here. So I can either fill in these little gaps here if I want, or I can simply just paint them black and they might not be noticeable. But this is the general size that I'm going with. So the next thing I'll do is cut out the circle that this will drop down into, and then we can start working on that. So, okay. All right, so I cut the circle out of the middle of the board, as I showed, And right now I have the board propped up on these spacers just to raise it up a little bit. It's close, but it's not exact. That's fine. I'll end up drawing a line on the outside of this to make it all even, a certain height, the height of these pieces. And then once I glue it into the board, when I'm done painting it and everything, then it'll be even. And then these other parts will just glue on the board itself. Now, as you can see there, I have a gap up at the top, so I made a mistake here somewhere along the way. Initially, when I was doing the original interior, the 4/4 of it that I had made, when I did 1/4 or maybe even a half, I had printed the spacers and I had printed the these parts at 200% like I did everything else. And for some reason I thought that they weren't correct, they weren't fitting. And I don't know if it's because I was measuring it on a 1/4 and not on like a half. I'm really not sure. It's confusing to me now, but for some reason I thought that these needed to be reduced down to 195%, which is what I did. But now obviously, as you can see, when I have these coming out to the edge, there's a big gap there, which obviously is due to the fact that I did not print these at 200%. So I'm not going to go back and reprint all these again, but I do have an extra one, so I can actually cut this piece and cut it to size and fill it in that gap there, and it's not going to be noticeable, and it won't affect the dome pie shapes because they're just going to be centered over each of these areas, so it really doesn't matter. And I can adjust the gap as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be this deep out. I'll play with it once I get going with it, and then get that to be correct and get that to be where it needs to be. But that's looking pretty sweet so far, at least if I fix that gap there. But I'll go ahead and put this aside for now. So I'm not ready to get this glued into place until I get it painted and figure out the little control rooms and lights for that and that sort of thing. And then we'll go from there. All right, so I'm starting to work on the fiber optics on the landing pad because I want to get those all done before I do the painting on it, the final painting on it, and get this attached onto the to the other part of the interior. Because until I get this done and ready to go, and I may not even attach it just yet, but I want to get it done before I start doing the painting, and I generally want to paint the other part of the interior before I get it glued down into the wood, so it's easier to handle. And then I can always glue this on at the very end or after I get the other part glued into the wood. But what I'm doing right now is I cut out all the strands of fiber optic that I need, and I gave myself a decent enough length on each of them. And I just took I just judged one of them to start with, and then after that I just kept measuring it against the rest of it and cutting off the other pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it sticking up a little bit like that, as you can see, so I can still do the painting. And then what I'll do is I'll snip off most of it and then just use a lighter to mushroom the end of it when I'm ready to go. And then just pull them all taut. And they're all going to go together into a tube, and then I'm going to have one light inside of it, like a Mega SMD warm white, lighting them all underneath. And I can always adjust the length. I think this length is enough. It doesn't have to be that long. They just have to be long enough to go into one, to all meet up and go into one tube. So, okay. So I was thinking about different ways of gluing them in. I want them to be in there pretty strong, but I don't want to damage the fibers, so I'm going to use some 5-minute epoxy. And I'm going to just do a little bit at a time, dab it in, and then run the, put some underneath it, pull it up a little bit so it glues inside the hole, and then just let them dry. And then I have this paint cap, which is small enough to fit in the center, so I can just keep putting this back down onto there, and then I'll just do a few at a time. And I figured there's 44 altogether all around, and then once I get them all glued, I'll just let them solidify for a few hours, and then I'll be able to start working with them and putting them into a tube and start working on the lights for them. All right. All right, and there are all of the completed fiber optics glued down into the platform, and I let it sit overnight. I ended up having to do like half at a time, mainly because the time you're fiddling with it and putting together, I use 5-minute epoxy, so you only have a few minutes working time. I ended up having it starting to solidify, so I didn't want to waste it, so I just did 5 at a time. And it wasn't really that difficult. I started with one side and I did half of it. Well, I actually stuck the fibers down flush with the base, with the top part, and then I dabbed on the 5-minute epoxy around them and the back. This is the bottom of it, and then I pushed them through so the 5-minute epoxy would actually be pulled down into the hole as well and make it more solidified. And then once those started to set up, I did the next set. And once I got a whole side done, I taped them together. These don't have to all be taped together. When I'm done, I'm going to remove the tape and they're just going to be all together. See, they're all in this tube right now. And they need to be trimmed still. But let me show you the top. So there are all the fibers sticking through. And the nice thing about this method is I can go ahead and paint it now, and I don't care if I get some paint on the tips of these ones sticking out, because I'm going to trim them down and mushroom them closer to the base, and then I can pull it down snug. And actually I cannot pull it down snug, never mind. I glued them in place, but it's not a problem. I already tested it. I can get like a heat source, like a soldering iron or something pretty close to it, or even a lighter if I hold it on the side and do it, and get them mushroomed a little bit. I don't really care if they stick up just a little bit, but basically, as I said, it won't hurt that I paint this, because I want to do that next, get this painted, and then I can trim those down and make them the right height that I want them to be. But let me go ahead and try to put the light on and show you what that's going to look like there. And I'm choosing this paint cap to not damage any of the fibers right now until I get those settled up. All right, so I'm just holding this in place, and you're seeing it in broad daylight too, but they're a lot brighter and a lot more visible to the naked eye than they are in the camera. But of course, those will be flush, but those are going to light up the perimeter of that. And I decided I'm not going to try to do any more holes in it and try to make more of them. It's just too many things can go wrong. In addition, that's another 44 of these. I would have to drill holes, make sure they're even, put fiber optic. It's just going to be too much. So I'm happy with that. And so that's ready to go. I'm just going to go ahead and start getting it painted. All right, so I'm going to start painting the platform and in the interior. I'm trying to get some ideas of the colors of it. So looking at these brightened up images from Mark Dowman, it appears as though the platform itself is slightly darker gray than the rest of the interior. Also possibly the sloped down platforms, but you can kind of see at the upper left corner that they're probably a little lighter. Here's an image of the open dome without any of the top parts, and it does certainly look like the center is darker than the rest of it. And again, a lot of this is perspective and shadows and things like that, but I'm going to kind of go with that kind of a tone to start. And remember, this is what we see in the film, so you really don't see any of that interior other than what the bright tungsten lights shine into it and show. So, all right. All right, so as I showed in the previous stills, I used some Vallejo Model Air colors. And initially I went over these areas, just the bottom and the landing pad, with the neutral gray, which is a little bit darker. And then I had an extra one of these that I had cut out, that basically all I did then was stick this down and over top of that and airbrushed over the rest of it using a cement gray color. And what I ended up doing then after that is to blend them together. I went over all of it with a misting of white. This is a process that I've used many times before. It's called a blending coat. I first learned of this through Aztec Dummy, through Lou D'Amaso. He uses that quite a lot. And I really prefer it over just trying to match colors that you want to be two different shades. Basically because what it does is it gives you a much more natural gradation as opposed to a stark color difference. And so you can see there's just a little bit of a darkness down in those flat parts, but it's not, in your face. It's not real stark, obvious difference between the rest of it. But your mind picks up on it, and your mind will see that and understand that they're a slightly different color. And then it's likewise on this. Once this goes on here, you can see there's a little bit of a difference between the gray on these outer edges and these side walls and that sort of thing than there is on this. But I didn't want it to be stark difference like that. I want it to be more of a subtle gradation. And I think that method works the best. Plus it leaves it a little uneven in certain spots, which you also want, because something this scale would not be one solid perfect color. So I like that where it is right now as a base color, and the same with that landing pad. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and start using some of my Tamiya weathering powders, and I'm going to put down some very, very faint like soot marks, things like that, maybe some of the gray, possibly pick up certain little bits and pieces here and there with some metallic just to kind of catch your eye, give it some character, that kind of thing. And a little more so on the landing pad where, obviously it's going to land and it's going to have spills and that kind of thing. I had talked about like a wash as far as these lines, but the problem is a wash is only going to work on a gloss. And I really don't want to go and gloss this because it really affects the colors and then come back over it with a wash. So it's going to be hard to do that. And the thing of it is, anytime you want to put anything like oil stains or spots, it has to be so small on a scale like this, because this thing is so giant that it would not look natural to have a big old spot right here. It wouldn't be that big. It would just be a tiny, tiny little spot. So the same with like the weathering powders. I'm just going to try to use the felt tip part of it and just put a slightest little line of it, streaks of it here and there, just to give it some character, but not really go overboard, because it's just not going to look natural in this scale. So, all right, so I'm working on the little control observation rooms that are in the 8 sides. So I'm going to make one for each, but I'm not going to light up all of them. I may just stagger them, we'll see. But I'm starting with the first one. So I generally just want the rectangle to be lit up and a little bit of detail. Looks like there's possibly people there, but I'm going to use a frosted piece of plastic on the front, so you're not going to see anything other than some shapes. So what I did was I just built a box that's the right dimensions of that opening. So, and I have an SMD just taped on the bottom right now. And I put some yellow Tamiya on it because I want this to be like a warm white, which kind of appears like in the film. Because I have a cool white chip SMD on the bottom of this. And I took 2 of my little people that I printed, and I have more of them, some of the failures. I had to cut them up quite a bit just so it's kind of a profile, and put them in there. I just painted them gray so they would show up against the backlight. But again, you're not really going to see in there and see the detail other than something's there. So let me turn that on and I'll show you. It's going to kind of wash out somewhat in the camera. All right, let me put that clear plastic on there and I'll show you what that looks like. There you go. And again, it's not as bright as this in real life. It's kind of washed out by the camera, but you can see there's something back there. There's a figure behind it, and it's just going to give it a little bit of detail as though there's somebody in that control room. So let me get this put together. Let me wire that down through the opening, and then we'll see what that looks like.
right, so there is the observation room just kind of stuck in there. It's not glued in place. And you can pretty much make out really well the two figures there. And it's not as bright in real life, it's dimmer, and so it looks pretty cool. What I did do at the end is once I got the clear frosted plastic glued onto the front, I took my Plastruct Bondine and I just ran it over it, so it just added just a slight bit of clearness to it to give you more detail of those figures behind it. But it didn't, you know, it's still frosted, so you're not making anything else up behind it. So that's a good first test. I really like that. It looks pretty sweet. I may want to dim it a little bit more, we'll see, or even maybe introduce some color in there. It would be kind of tricky though, but definitely a good proof of concept. I think that's going to work well. And then the wire can just come down through the bottom, out through the opening down here, and I can pull the ones into the middle, fold them to the middle, and wire them together to light them up. So once I decide which ones I'm going to do. And like I said, I'm going to create little boxes for each, but I'm not going to light each of them because in the film we only see like 2 of them lit. So I might only do a few of them. So, all right, but pretty awesome. All right, so kind of getting an idea of what it's going to look like underneath the dome parts. It's going to look pretty cool down in there. And keep in mind, you're going to have 2 domes slices next to each other with a space between them, so you're just going to kind of see bits and pieces through it. But I think that's going to look pretty cool for sure. And again, it looks a lot dimmer in real life than it does. I might try to reposition the hotspot right in the center below them, but we'll see. But it looks pretty cool. So I'm working on getting the fiber optics all put together into one tube or one area that I can light and try to keep them compact onto the bottom. So here it is. Here's the landing pad. Obviously this is the top, and I just have it sitting on this paint cap because it's nice to be able to put it on there and not have it, the little strand sticking down, affected. So I've tried a couple of things. My first attempts were basically to get all of them wrapped together into one tight strand and use 5-minute epoxy and get them glued into this tube here, or pieces of this tube I've tried. And that's not the one. I was trying to find one. There's a couple that I have that have glue in them. I probably threw them away. But I failed a couple of times. It was really tricky to get that. You can see that the ends of these are kind of crusty from the 5-minute epoxy. It didn't glue any of them together, but I determined that it's really hard to try to get the 4 different sides to come together and stay in one thing. Plus, when I do it that way, it wants to bunch them up, and then it's fighting against the 4 sides, so it was still up pretty high. And it wouldn't have been as compact. So what I've decided to do instead, which I'm still working on, is to do each of the 4 sides separately. And so instead of using the plastic tube, I had a little smaller diameter version of some aluminum tube. And really it doesn't matter to me if it's aluminum or plastic, it makes no difference. Although this will be somewhat light blocking, but I don't need it to be light blocked. All I need is to have these contained. So it's much easier to do one side of it and keep them in a nice solid tight strand. And plus, once I get this glued in place, so what I'll do is I will figure out as far down that I can push it without putting too much strain on these, so I don't want to break them. They're pretty sturdy though. But then what I'll do is I'll get some 5-minute epoxy. I will put it around underneath, you know, pull the tube up, put it around the actual piece, and then slide it down over it and let that solidify. Once that does, then I can cut it flush and put more epoxy in the top to hold it in place. And then what I figured is once that's done, these will go down a whole lot easier to the bottom to be more flat. to this part. And then what I can do is I can position them so that all 4 of them meet up in the middle of this and put my light right down on top of them. Maybe put some little box around it or something like that. And then just have the SMD pointing straight down and lighting a small area that'll light all of the fiber optic strands. So that way these will be a whole lot more compact and flatter to the surface rather than sticking way up in the air. There'll still be a little bit, obviously, because I can't bend these flat or they would break. But I think that's going to work a lot better. And then plus I'm working with a much smaller area or amount of strands that I don't have to worry about them being a problem. Glue it one at a time, and then I can reinforce it. So, all right, so let me continue working on that. All right, so a few more modifications, and I got it to work really, really well. I'm really happy with how that turned out. So I got all of the aluminum tubes glued onto the strands, and I reinforced them, let them set up really well for a couple of hours. And I still had a bunch sticking out the end. So instead of cutting them flush and trying to bring these tubes of aluminum together, I figured I would leave them as they were. And I took this tube, this is just a styrene tube, a larger one, and I drilled 4 holes in it, one on each side. And I tested it first, and then I realized it was going to work, so I glued it down onto the center with 5-minute epoxy. And then all I've done is just taken those strands, stuck them down into that hole, and it doesn't matter if they're sticking up or if they're sideways. The light's going to shine on it and it's going to come through. And they all go in nicely. They're not actually glued in just yet, but it gives me a fairly compact little package there, and they stay in there. Once I get it all glued on with the light, I can put some glue around the strands there and glue those in place as well. Sorry for the shakiness. I also went ahead and I took a lighter and held this sideways and held it close, and I mushroomed. Well, first I trimmed them down, then I mushroomed all the ends of the strips that were sticking up. And it's okay if there's a bit of a bump on them, because the lights do tend to stick up a little bit from the surface, but it's nothing major. All right, and the last thing I did was I took my SMD and I cut another circle of styrene that would fit on top of that, cut a hole in it, and I glued in my SMD. I have a little bit of yellow paint on it, which I may put a little bit more, because again, this is a cool white Mega SMD, and I want it to be warm white. And then I just 5-minute epoxied it on the back. All right, so all I have to do is glue that in place, and then that will light up all of the lights. So let me do that and show you how that's going to look. All right, and there is the finished landing pad. It's not glued into the bottom, the base here, but I do have the light glued on the bottom, and the batteries are down inside of it. It looks pretty fantastic. There's a slight variation in some of the mushroomed parts of them, but it shows up more on the camera than it does in real life. And again, just like I was saying about the observation room, it looks different in real life. Actually, these look brighter in real life, and they look more even. So it really looks pretty cool, and it definitely looks like individual little lights, which is pretty sweet, and kind of gives you that impression. Sorry. Now, if I go clear down flat, you're not going to see it as well because of the mushroomed heads, but the whole base is going to be angled up
on the base, it's all going to be angled, so you're going to be seeing a straight-on shot,
and especially through the tops of the domes as well. So that's going to look pretty sweet, and it's going to give that image that you see in the film that outlines the landing pad. So I am really happy with it. I think definitely these are enough lights. I didn't need to do any more. It would have looked too crowded, but that looks pretty cool. So, all right, fantastic. Let me just put in the observation room, and then I'll wrap up this video with the image of both of those. All right, and there is the landing pad lit up in the one control room that I created, the first one. Looking pretty sweet. Let me turn off the top light so it's not causing it to look faded out. All right, there we go. And like I said before, the observation room doesn't look that bright. It's a lot dimmer in real life. And the lights definitely look a lot more even in the landing pad, so they're pretty sweet. All right. They also look a lot more yellow in the camera because I made them like a warm white, but they look warm white in real life. They don't look that yellowish, but it's not the bright, cool white. So it looks pretty sweet. All right, fantastic. All right, so that's going to wrap up part 2 of my build for this fantastic Clavius base. Really happy with how it's turning out. Really happy with how it's looking, and I'm happy with the progress that I've made. And after, well, since I've got the main lights for the landing pad completed, I'll continue to work on the little observation rooms, and then I'll start getting it glued down into the actual wood base and start working on how that's going to be set up and angled and that kind of thing. So I'll be looking at that on the next video. But thanks to all my new subscribers. Stay tuned, and we'll continue working on this fantastic Clavius stone. Thanks a lot.